My son's wedding was on a Saturday in October, and by 9 o'clock that night, my wife was sitting in our car in the parking lot with a red mark across her cheek, and I was the one who had to decide what kind of man I was going to be. I didn't call the police. I know that's the first thing people say. I know. But I need you to understand what it felt like to be standing in that banquet hall, in front of 230 people, with my wife's hand pressed to her face and my son, looking at his shoes. I'm getting ahead of myself, let me back up. My name is Patrick. I'm 53 years old. I work in commercial real estate in Calgary, Alberta. I've been married to my wife, Carol, for 29 years. We raised one child together, our son, Connor. We gave him everything we had, not in the spoiled sense. We weren't the kind of parents who said yes to everything. We said yes to the things that mattered. Hockey camps, university tuition, a loan for his first car that he paid back in full, which I'll be honest, I was proud of. We raised a good kid, or so we thought. Connor met Serena about 4 years ago, at a work event in downtown Calgary. She was in marketing, he was in software development. They were both in their late 20s, both ambitious, both focused on building something. I understood the attraction. She was sharp, confident, put together. The first time we had dinner with her at our house, she spent most of the meal talking about herself. But I chalked that up to nerves. People do that when they're anxious. Carol was nothing but kind to her. She asked about Serena's family, her job, what she liked to do on weekends. Serena answered in short sentences and redirected the conversation to Connor, which I thought was a little odd, but again, first dinner, I let it go. Over the next year, the dinners became less frequent. Connor always had a reason. Work was busy. Serena had plans with her friends. The drive from their condo to our house in the southwest took 45 minutes when traffic was bad, which in Calgary it always is. I didn't push. Carol didn't push. We respected that he had a life. What I noticed, though, was that Serena stopped asking Carol anything. Not just the getting to know you questions, any questions at all. She would sit at our dinner table and direct every sentence to Connor, or to me, or to no one in particular. Carol would say something and Serena would respond with one word, or a polite smile, or she'd turn to Connor and continue whatever she'd been saying before. It was subtle enough that I second-guessed myself. Maybe she was just reserved. Maybe Carol reminded her of someone she had conflict with. I don't know. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Carol never complained. That's the kind of woman she is. She would come downstairs after one of these visits and ask me if I thought she'd said something wrong, and I'd tell her no, and she'd nod, and that would be the end of it. But I could see it. The way she'd offer Serena a coffee and get a headshake in return. The way she'd try to find common ground and come up with nothing. She wasn't hurt so much as confused. She just kept asking herself what she'd done. Connor proposed to Serena on New Year's Eve of last year. We found out through a text message, a group text. Connor, Carol, me, and both of Serena's parents whom I had never met, the message said. She said yes. Followed by a photo of Serena's hand, the ring, and a blurred background that looked like a restaurant downtown. Carol texted back immediately. She was genuinely happy. I watched her face light up reading that message, and I thought, this is going to be okay. Whatever weirdness existed before, this is a new chapter. We'll find a way in. We offered to help with the wedding. Carol said she'd be happy to assist with anything. Decorations, catering research, guest list coordination, whatever was useful. She didn't want to overstep. She just wanted to be involved. Serena's mother, Diane, was apparently the one handling most of the planning. That was fine. Carol sent Connor a message saying as much and asked if there was anything she could do. He said he'd ask Serena. We never heard back. We were invited to one venue viewing. 1. Carol got dressed up, drove 45 minutes, stood in a hotel ballroom with Serena and Diane, and offered her thoughts when asked, which was twice. The whole visit lasted under an hour. On the drive home, she didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, and then she said, I think she just doesn't like me. I didn't have a good answer for that. The engagement was 14 months long. In those 14 months, we saw Connor maybe 7 or 8 times. Each time, Serena came with him, which I didn't mind, but the dynamic never changed. She was polite to me. She barely acknowledged Carol. At Christmas, we gave them both gifts. Connor's was wrapped in blue paper, Serena's in gold, because Carol had read somewhere that she liked the color. Serena opened it and said thanks without looking up. Connor watched this happen and said nothing. I had a conversation with him in March, about 6 months before the wedding. I drove to their condo, asked him to come down to the car, and we sat in the underground parking for an hour. I told him what I'd been observing. I told him it wasn't about whether Serena liked us. People don't always click, that's life. But that there was a basic level of respect owed to his mother, and that I wasn't seeing it. I kept my voice even. I wasn't angry. I was his father, trying to tell him something important before it became something unfixable. He listened. He nodded. He said he'd talk to Serena. He also said, "Dad, you have to understand. Serena's had a complicated relationship with her own mom. She's working through stuff. It's not about Carol." I said, "Okay. But your mother is not Serena's therapist. She's your mother. And she deserves to be treated like one." He said he understood. He went back upstairs. A week later, Carol received a text from Serena. It said, "I hear you've had concerns. I'd like to resolve this before the wedding. No warmth, no apology, just, I hear you've had concerns." Like they were two colleagues in a mediation meeting. Carol responded with grace. She said she'd love to grab a coffee. Serena said she was busy for the next few weeks but would reach out. She never did. The wedding was on the second Saturday of October. The venue was a banquet hall in Cochrane, about 45 minutes west of Calgary, with views of the Rockies from the reception windows. I'll give Diane that. She picked a beautiful location. Carol wore a dark green dress. She'd spent 3 weeks looking for it. She looked lovely. She was nervous, in the way mothers get nervous at their kids' weddings, not because of anything specific, but because of everything all at once. The ceremony was in a small chapel adjacent to the hall. I sat in the second row. Carol was beside me. Connor stood at the front with his groomsmen, and I watched him watch the door when Serena walked in. And he looked like a man who had never seen anything more beautiful. And I thought, whatever else is true, he loves her. I held on to that. The reception started well enough. The hall was packed. Their combined guest list was just over 200 people, most of them Serena's family and their friends. We knew maybe 30 people in the room. We sat at a table near the center, with Connor's childhood friends Ryan and Derek, and their partners, which helped. Carol laughed more at that table than she had in months. The speeches started around 7. Serena's maid of honor went first, then Ryan on Connor's side, then Diane. Each one was warm, a little funny, personal. Then Connor stood up. I expected a short speech. He's not a man of many words. He thanked the venue, the vendors, Serena's family by name, her parents, her sister, her uncle who'd flown in from Vancouver. He thanked his groomsmen. He thanked his friends. Then he looked at Serena and said something about how she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and Carol squeezed my hand under the table. And then he said, "And I want to thank my dad. Dad, you've always shown me what it means to work hard and be steady. I love you." That was it. That was his mention of us. His dad. No mention of his mother. No, Mom, thank you for everything you've given me. No, Carol, I love you. Nothing. I looked at Carol. Her face had gone very still. She was smiling, but it was the smile a person puts on when they're working hard not to let something show. The dinner service started. Carol excused herself to go to the washroom. She was gone a while, and when she came back her eyes were a little red at the corners. But she sat down and said, "The salmon is good, you should try the salmon." So I tried the salmon. About halfway through dinner, Serena came by our table. Not to talk, she was doing a round, greeting guests, the usual bride circuit. She stopped at Ryan and his wife first hugged them, laughed at something. Then she got to us. She looked at Carol, and something shifted in her expression. I don't know how to describe it exactly. It was like a door closing. She leaned close and said, in a voice low enough that only we could hear, "I need you to know that this is my day. If you can't be genuinely happy for us, you should leave. Nobody here actually wants you." Carol didn't move. I didn't move. And then Serena raised her hand and she slapped my wife across the face. Not hard enough to knock her sideways. Hard enough to leave a mark. Hard enough for Ryan's wife to gasp and reach across the table. Hard enough for Carol to press her palm to her cheek and look at me with an expression I will never fully be able to describe. Part shock, part shame, part something I recognized as grief. I stood up. I kept my voice low. I said, "We're leaving now." I said it to Carol, not to Serena. I took Carol's hand. She stood. We walked through the hall without stopping. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. We got our coats from the coat check and we went to the car and I drove out of that parking lot and I did not look back. Connor texted me 11 minutes later. The message said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. Please come back." I didn't respond. We drove the 45 minutes back to Calgary mostly in silence. Carol had the window cracked even though it was cold, and she kept her face turned toward the outside air. At some point she said, "I should have known." I told her that wasn't true. She said, "I just wanted him to be happy. I said I knew. I put Carol to bed with a cold cloth and a cup of tea, and then I went downstairs to the kitchen and I sat at our table for about 2 hours. I had two decisions in front of me. The first was whether to call the police. I want to address this directly because I know it's what a lot of people would ask. Physical assault is physical assault, regardless of who does it, regardless of the setting. Carol had been struck in front of witnesses. There were people at that table who saw it happen. I could have called the RCMP that same night. I thought about it seriously. What I came back to, sitting in that kitchen, was my son, not Serena. I had very few feelings about Serena that weren't rage by that point, but Connor. If I pressed charges, his wife would be arrested the night of his wedding. Whatever happened between us going forward, I would be the father who had his daughter-in-law taken out in handcuffs on his son's wedding night. I didn't want that to be the story. Not yet. Not as the first move. What I decided instead was silence. Complete silence. Not a text back to Connor. Not a call the next morning. Nothing. He called Sunday morning. I let it go to voicemail. He left a 4-minute message rambling and sorry sounding, and I listened to it once and then I went for a drive. Monday morning I called my lawyer. Not to pursue a criminal charge at that moment, but to document everything. The date, the location, the names of witnesses who had been at the table. Ryan and his wife had already texted Carol separately, asking if she was okay and saying they'd both seen what happened. I forwarded those messages to my lawyer. I wanted a record that existed somewhere other than my memory. Then I called Connor, not Serena. Connor. I told him I would meet him for coffee, one time, at a place I chose on a day I chose without Serena present. He agreed immediately. We met at a Tim Hortons in Okotoks halfway between his place and mine. He came in looking like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. He sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a coffee, and he started to apologize before he'd even taken his coat off. I let him finish, then I said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. When you were standing at that podium last night, did you make a choice not to mention your mother?" He went quiet. "Connor," he said, "Serena had asked me to keep it shorter. She said my speech was running long." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "She reviewed your speech." He said yes. I said, "And in the edited version, I made the cut and your mother didn't." He looked at the table. He said, "Dad, it wasn't like that." I said, "I know exactly what it was like. I watched your mother come back from the washroom with red eyes and tell me the salmon was good. I know exactly what it was like." He cried. I hadn't seen my son cry since his grandmother's funeral, 14 years ago. He put his face in his hands and he sat there for a long time, and I didn't comfort him, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He's still my kid. That doesn't stop. But I had something to say, and I waited until he was ready to hear it. "Your wife assaulted your mother," I said, "in front of witnesses, at your wedding. And you stood there and said nothing, and then you texted me and asked us to come back. I don't know what you expected me to do with that." He said, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I said, "I know you didn't. But you knew who she was. You knew how she'd treated your mother for 3 years, and you said nothing then either." That landed. I could see it land. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "That's not a question I can answer for you, but I'll tell you what I need. I need Serena to apologize to your mother in person, not a text, not a letter. In person, face to face, with Carol choosing the time and place. And I need you to apologize to your mother, separately, not to me, to her, because it was her face, Connor, not mine." He nodded. He said he understood. He also said, "Dad, she's my wife." I said, "I know she's your wife, and Carol's your mother. You've got both of those things to figure out how to hold at the same time. I can't do that for you." I left first. I paid for both coffees. Here's what I didn't tell him that morning, because he didn't need to know it yet. I had spent Sunday afternoon making 2 phone calls, neither of which was to the police. The first was to my business partner, Alan. Alan and I have been running our commercial real estate firm together for over 20 years. We do a reasonable amount of business with a development company in Airdrie, one of whose directors happened to be Serena's father, Robert. I had known Robert was in that industry. Connor had mentioned it once, but I'd never connected the dots until the wedding, when I saw Robert's name on the dinner program and recognized the company. I had not spoken to Robert at the reception. Under the circumstances, I had not spoken to anyone. What I said to Alan that Sunday was simply, "I need you to know that my daughter-in-law assaulted my wife at the wedding last night. I want you to know that before it comes up in any other context." I said nothing more. Alan is a smart man. He understood what I was telling him without my having to say it plainly. The second call was to Serena's direct supervisor at her marketing firm, a woman I had met once at a charity fundraiser 2 years before. I didn't threaten anything. I simply called and said I wanted to speak with her confidentially, and I described what had happened. I said I wasn't calling for any specific purpose. I said I wanted someone she trusted professionally to be aware. I don't know exactly what followed from those calls. That's the honest answer. I know that Robert called Connor on Monday evening. I know this because Connor texted me afterward, and the text said, "Dad, what did you do?" I texted back. I made sure the right people had accurate information. He didn't respond to that for 3 days. The month that followed was the quietest of my marriage. Carol went to work. I went to work. We had dinner together every night at the kitchen table, and we talked about regular things. What we'd seen on the news, whether we should replace the back fence, a recipe she was thinking about trying. We did not talk about Connor. Not directly. I think we were both too tired. He called Carol on the 4th week. Not me. Her. I was in the garage when I heard her pick up. I stayed there. I didn't listen, but I could hear from her tone, quiet, guarded at first, then softer, that it was a different kind of call than any she'd had with him in months. It lasted almost an hour. When she came to find me, she had been crying, but the different kind, the releasing kind. She said, "He's going to try to get Serena to come with him to see me. He says she needs time, but that he's not letting this go." I said, "How do you feel about that?" She said, "I don't know yet, but he called me Patrick. He actually called me." That was enough for one day. 6 weeks after the wedding, Serena came to our house. She came with Connor. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd had all those dinners, where she'd looked through Carol like she wasn't there, and she said, "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong, and I'm sorry." It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't full of explanation, or context, or reasons. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think she was entirely sorry. I think she was sorry that things had gone this far. I think she was sorry about the professional fallout, whatever it had been. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand what she took from my wife that night. But she said it. She looked Carol in the eye and she said it. Carol said, "Thank you for coming." That was all. No absolution, no declaration that everything was fine. Just, "Thank you for coming," which was more than Serena had earned, and exactly right. Connor came back 2 weeks after that, on his own. He and Carol sat in the living room for 2 hours while I stayed in the kitchen, and I don't know everything they said to each other, but I heard her laugh once, a real laugh, and it was the first time I'd heard that sound in our house in a long time. He's been in therapy since November. Individual sessions, not couples therapy, though I understand that's also in discussion. He told me on one of our coffee meetings, which have now become a regular thing, that he's been working on what his counselor calls the conflict avoidance pattern. He said it like he'd just discovered it, like it was new information. I had to work very hard not to say, "Son, I tried to tell you this in a parking garage in March, but that's not the point. The point is that he's figuring it out. Serena and Carol are not close. I don't think they'll ever be close, and I've stopped expecting that. What I watch for now is whether Carol is treated with basic dignity, whether she's acknowledged when she speaks, whether her presence in a room registers. Some days it does, some days we're still working on it. Last month, Connor called me on a Thursday evening, just to talk. Not about anything in particular. His job, the cold snap, a hockey game he'd caught at the Saddledom. We talked for 45 minutes. At the end he said, "Dad, I know I let you both down. I want you to know I know that." I said, "I know you know." He said, "Is it enough? What I'm doing, is it enough?" I thought about Carol at the kitchen table in October, with a cloth pressed to her cheek. I thought about her telling me the salmon was good. I thought about the parking lot, the drive home, the window cracked in the cold. I said, "It's enough for today. Keep going." That's all I ask. Keep going, and he is.